The candle nearly went out when Alina Whitmore's hand trembled against the table. Her aunt's voice cut through the quiet dining room like a blade drawn too fast. "No gentleman will ever want you," Lady Margaret Whitmore said, setting down her wine glass with a sharp click. "Look at you, 22 years old, no dowry worth mentioning, and that dreadful habit of speaking your mind. You have ruined every chance I have given you." Alina did not answer right away. She folded her napkin with slow, careful movements, the way she always did when she needed a moment to keep her voice steady. Around them, the dining hall of Whitmore House sat heavy with silence, broken only by the soft crackle of the fireplace and the ticking of the mantel clock. "I did not ruin anything, Aunt," Alina finally said. "I simply refused to marry a man who insulted the servants and mocked the poor at his own table." "Refused?" Lady Margaret laughed, a short, cold sound. "You refused Lord Pemberton, a baron, a man with land and income, offering to take you off my hands, and you refused him over a joke about servants." "It was not a joke, it was cruelty dressed as wit." Her aunt's eyes narrowed. Across the table, Alina's cousin Charlotte kept her gaze fixed on her plate, too afraid to look up, too used to these evenings to expect them to end any other way. "You will learn," Lady Margaret said, rising from her chair, "that cruelty and comfort often wear the same coat. And you will learn it the hard way because I am done indulging your pride. No gentleman will ever want you, Alina. Not with your tongue, not with your empty purse. You will die in this house, unmarried and forgotten, and it will be no one's fault but your own." She swept out of the room, her skirts hissing against the floor. The door shut with a force that rattled the china. Alina sat very still. She had heard versions of this speech before, delivered in different moods with different words, but always carrying the same message. She was a burden. She was unwanted. She was, in her aunt's eyes, a debt that had never been properly paid. Charlotte finally looked up. "She does not mean it," she whispered. "She means every word," Alina said quietly. "She has meant it since the day my parents died and left me on her doorstep." Charlotte reached across the table and took her cousin's hand. It was a small gesture, but it was the only kindness Alina had received all evening, and she held onto it the way a drowning person holds onto driftwood. Later that night, Alina climbed the narrow stairs to her room at the top of the house, the room that had once belonged to a servant before her aunt decided even that space was too generous for an unwanted niece. She lit a single candle and sat by the window, looking out over the dark street below. She thought of her parents. She had been 12 when the fever took them both within the same week, leaving her with nothing but a small trunk of belongings and a letter addressed to her aunt, asking for shelter. Lady Margaret had taken her in, not out of love, but out of duty to family name and appearance. It was better, her aunt often said, to be seen caring for an orphaned niece than to be known for turning one away. 10 years had passed since then. 10 years of quiet meals, sharp words, and the constant reminder that Alina's place in the household was conditional, fragile, something that could be revoked at any moment if she failed to behave, failed to marry, failed to disappear into the background the way a proper unwanted relative should. She had tried, in her own way, to make peace with it. She read books late into the night, borrowed from the small library downstairs when her aunt was not watching. She walked in the mornings before the household woke, finding a strange comfort in the empty streets and the cold air. She had learned to keep her opinions to herself in most company, though tonight, faced with Lord Pemberton's cruelty toward a serving girl, she had not been able to stay silent. She did not regret it. Even now, with her aunt's words still ringing in her ears, she did not regret refusing a man who found joy in humiliating those beneath him. But regret and consequence were different things, and Alina knew the consequence was coming. Her aunt did not make threats she did not intend to keep. The next morning brought a letter. Lady Margaret read it at breakfast, her expression unreadable until she finished, at which point a thin smile crossed her lips. She set the letter down beside her plate and looked at Alina with something close to satisfaction. "Lady Ashworth is holding a gathering next week," she said. "A small affair but well attended. Several eligible gentlemen will be present, including a few I have not yet introduced you to. You will attend a leaner and you will behave yourself this time. No opinions on politics. No opinions on servants. No opinions at all if you can manage it." "Yes, Aunt," Alina said, because there was no other answer that would end the conversation quickly. "This is your chance to prove me wrong," Lady Margaret continued, though her tone suggested she expected no such outcome. "Prove that a gentleman might want you after all, though I confess I am not holding my breath." Charlotte, sitting beside Alina, gave her a small, encouraging smile when their aunt was not looking. Alina returned it, though her heart felt heavy with dread rather than hope. She had attended enough of these gatherings to know how they went. She would be introduced to a string of gentlemen, most of whom cared more about her aunt's connections than about Alina herself. She would smile politely, answer questions carefully, and try not to say anything that might be considered too forward or too honest. And at the end of the evening, she would return home, having failed once again to secure the kind of match her aunt demanded. It was a performance she had grown tired of, but one she could not refuse to give. The week passed slowly. Alina spent her mornings walking, her afternoons helping Charlotte with her needlework, and her evenings enduring her aunt's instructions on posture, conversation, and the proper way to laugh at a gentleman's joke even when it was not funny. "You must appear interested," Lady Margaret told her one evening, "even when you are not, especially when you are not. Gentlemen do not like women who think too much. They like women who make them feel clever." Alina bit back the urge to point out that a marriage built on pretending to be less intelligent than one truly was seemed like a poor foundation for happiness. She had learned over the years which battles were worth fighting, and which were not worth the exhaustion that followed. On the morning of the gathering, Charlotte helped her dress in a pale blue gown that had once belonged to Charlotte herself, altered slightly to fit Alina's smaller frame. It was not new, and it was not fashionable, but it was clean and well made, and Alina was grateful for it. "You look lovely," Charlotte said, adjusting a ribbon in Alina's hair. "I look like I am wearing your old gown," Alina replied, though there was no bitterness in it, only quiet acceptance. "You look like yourself," Charlotte said firmly, "and that is more than most people at this gathering will be able to say." Alina smiled at that, a real smile, the first one in days. The carriage ride to Lady Ashworth's estate took nearly an hour, during which Lady Margaret reviewed, once again, the names and titles of the gentlemen Alina was expected to charm. Alina listened with half her attention, the other half occupied with watching the countryside pass by the window, the fields turning gold in the late afternoon light. She did not know, as the carriage rolled toward the estate, that this evening would be the one that changed everything. She did not know that among the crowd of gentlemen her aunt had listed, there would be one man whose name was not on the list at all, a man who had arrived uninvited by any formal introduction, traveling under a name that was not entirely his own. She only knew that she was tired, and that she wished, more than anything, that someone might look at her and see something other than a burden waiting to be married off. She had no way of knowing that her wish was about to be answered, though not in any way she could have predicted. The estate came into view as the sun began to set, its windows glowing with candlelight, the sound of music already drifting out into the evening air. Carriages lined the drive, gentlemen and ladies moving toward the entrance in their finest clothes, laughter and conversation blending together into a warm, golden noise. Alina stepped down from the carriage and smoothed her skirts, taking a breath to steady herself. Beside her, Lady Margaret adjusted her own gloves and cast a final, appraising look over her niece. "Remember," she said quietly, "smile, say little, and for heaven's sake do not mention servants." Alina nodded, though something in her chest tightened at the reminder of everything she was expected to hide. She followed her aunt up the steps and into the grand hall, where candlelight flickered against gold-trimmed walls, and the sound of a string quartet filled the air. She had no idea that somewhere in that crowded room, a man in a plain gray coat, standing slightly apart from the others, had just noticed her enter, and had not been able to look away since. His name, though no one in the room knew it yet, was Nathaniel Ashcombe, and he was the Duke of Ravensbrook. He had come to Lady Ashworth's gathering not out of any interest in meeting eligible young women, though that was precisely what everyone assumed of any unmarried duke at a social event. He had come because his closest friend, Lord Ashworth, had asked him to attend, and because Nathaniel had grown so weary of the endless parade of women pursuing his title rather than his character that he had taken to introducing himself, whenever possible, without any mention of his rank at all. Tonight he had done exactly that. He had arrived not as the Duke of Ravensbrook, but simply as Mr. Ashcombe, a private gentleman of modest means, curious to see how differently people treated him when they believed he had nothing to offer. He had not expected the evening to hold anything of interest, until Eleanor Whitmore walked through the door. There was nothing particularly remarkable about her gown, nothing extraordinary about her jewelry, for she wore almost none, but there was something in the way she carried herself, a quiet dignity that seemed entirely her own, untouched by the performance that surrounded her on every side. She did not glance around the room searching for attention. She did not laugh too loudly or smile too eagerly at the men who looked her way. She simply walked, calm and composed, as though she had already decided the evening would not change her. Nathaniel found himself watching her long after she had passed, wondering who she was, and why, in a room full of women desperate to be noticed, she seemed the only one who did not care to be. He did not yet know her name. He did not know the cruel words her aunt had spoken the night before, or the 10 years of quiet loneliness that had shaped the calm expression she wore so effortlessly. He knew only that something about her had caught his attention in a way nothing had in a very long time, and that he intended, before the evening ended, to find a way to speak with her. He had no way of knowing, standing there in the candle-lit hall, that this simple decision would eventually lead him to ride through a storm in the middle of the night, risking his reputation and everything his family expected of him, all for the sake of a woman he had not yet even properly met. The evening had only just begun, and already, without either of them realizing it, 2 lives had quietly started to change course. Nathaniel Ashcombe waited until the first dance had ended before he made his way across the crowded hall toward the small group of women gathered near the tall windows. He moved carefully, without hurry, the way a man does when he does not wish to draw attention to his intentions. He had spent enough evenings in ballrooms to know that eagerness was often mistaken for desperation, and desperation was the fastest way to end a conversation before it began. Eleanor stood near the edge of the group, half listening to the chatter around her, half watching the dancers move across the polished floor. She had already spoken with 3 gentlemen that evening, each conversation shorter and more forgettable than the last. One had spent 10 minutes describing his hunting dogs. Another had asked, without any real curiosity, whether she played the pianoforte, and had stopped listening before she finished her answer. The third had simply looked at her gown, calculated its worth, and moved on to a wealthier prospect within minutes. She was beginning to wish she had stayed home. "Forgive me for intruding," a voice said beside her, low and unhurried. "But I could not help noticing that you seem far more interested in the dance itself than in anyone dancing it." Eleanor turned, startled, and found herself looking at a man she did not recognize. He was tall, with dark hair slightly too long to be considered fashionable, and eyes that held a quiet, watchful intelligence. His coat was well made but plain, without the excessive trim and embellishment favored by most gentlemen in attendance. He looked, she thought, like a man who had wandered into the wrong sort of gathering, and was doing his best not to show his discomfort. "Is that so unusual?" she asked. "I find the dance far more honest than most conversations one has at these gatherings." A faint smile crossed his face. "That is a rather bold thing to say to a stranger." "You approach me, sir. I assumed boldness was permitted." He laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise even him. "Mr. Ashcombe," he said, offering a slight bow, "and you have the advantage of me since I do not know your name." "Eleanor Whitmore." "Miss Whitmore," he said her name carefully as though testing its shape. "Tell me, what makes a conversation dishonest in your estimation?" Alina considered the question, surprised that he had asked it at all. Most gentlemen did not ask her opinion on anything, let alone something that required actual thought. When people speak only to be admired rather than to be understood, she said finally. Tonight, I have been asked about my accomplishments, my family, my prospects. No one has asked what I think about anything at all. And what do you think, Miss Whitmore, about anything at all? There was no mockery in his tone, only genuine curiosity, and something in that made Alina lower her guard just slightly. I think, she said, that most people in this room are performing a role they have been taught since childhood, and that very few of them are truly happy doing it. A dangerous thing to say at a ball. Perhaps, but you did ask. They spoke for nearly half an hour after that, though neither of them noticed the time passing. Nathaniel found himself asking questions he rarely bothered to ask anyone, curious about her opinions on books, on the countryside, on the strange unfairness of a world that judged women so harshly for speaking their minds while praising men for the very same trait. Alina found herself answering honestly, more honestly than she had spoken to anyone outside of Charlotte in years, drawn in by the way he actually listened, weighing her words rather than waiting for his turn to speak. She did not know he was a duke. He had introduced himself simply as Mr. Ashcombe, and nothing in his manner suggested wealth or title, though there was something in his bearing, a quiet confidence that she could not quite place. He did not tell her the truth, not because he intended to deceive her, but because he had spent so many years being valued only for his title that the chance to be seen, even briefly, as an ordinary man felt like something worth protecting. You dance beautifully, Charlotte said later, when Alina rejoined her near the refreshment table. Alina had not even realized she had danced twice with Mr. Ashcombe until Charlotte mentioned it, so completely had she lost herself in their conversation. He was easy to talk to, Alina admitted. Easy to talk to or easy to look at? Charlotte asked, a teasing smile on her lips. Both perhaps, Alina said, and found herself smiling despite the exhaustion of the evening. Across the room, Lady Margaret had noticed the exchange as well, though her interpretation was considerably more calculating. She approached Lord Ashworth, their host, under the pretense of admiring the flowers arranged near the windows, and casually inquired about the identity of the man her niece had been speaking with. Ashcombe? Lord Ashworth repeated, glancing across the room with visible amusement. My lady, I am afraid you have been misled. That gentleman is not simply Mr. Ashcombe. Lady Margaret's interest sharpened immediately. Oh. That is Nathaniel Ashcombe, the Duke of Ravensbrook. He prefers, on occasion, to attend gatherings without his title announced. Says it lets him see people's true character, rather than their performance for a duke. Lady Margaret's fan stilled in her hand. She looked across the room at Alina, who was still smiling at something Charlotte had said, entirely unaware of the conversation taking place a few feet away. A duke? Her niece, the girl she had called unmarriageable only the night before, had somehow managed to capture the attention of a duke. Lady Margaret's mind began to work quickly, calculating possibilities, imagining the social advantage such a connection could bring, even as a colder, more familiar instinct rose alongside it, an instinct that told her this opportunity, however unlikely, was not one she intended to let Alina control. She would need to be careful. She would need to manage this situation the way she managed everything else in her household, with a firm hand and very little regard for what Alina herself might want. For now, though, she said nothing. She simply watched and waited and began quietly to plan. The evening drew on, and eventually it came time for Nathaniel to take his leave. He found Alina near the garden doors, where she had stepped out briefly for fresh air, away from the noise and heat of the crowded hall. I hope I have not kept you from more interesting company, he said, joining her at the railing that overlooked the darkened garden. You have been the only interesting company all evening, Alina replied honestly. He smiled at that, though something in his expression grew more thoughtful, almost hesitant. Miss Whitmore, I wonder if I might call on you, properly I mean, with your family's permission. Elinor's heart lifted at the request, though she quickly reminded herself not to hope too much. Gentlemen said such things often, and rarely followed through, especially once they learned how little her family had to offer in the way of dowry or connections. "You may call," she said carefully, "though I should warn you that my aunt manages such matters closely, and she is not always welcoming to suitors she has not personally selected." "I am accustomed to difficult company," Nathaniel said, a hint of dry humor in his voice. "I believe I can manage one aunt." Elinor laughed, and the sound of it, genuine and unguarded, struck something in Nathaniel that he had not expected. He had met countless women over the years, many of them beautiful, many of them clever, but none of them had laughed the way Elinor did, without calculation, without performance, simply because something had truly amused her. He left the gathering that night with her name held carefully in his mind, and a growing certainty that he wanted to know more of her, far more than a single evening's conversation could provide. What he did not yet know was how quickly circumstances would turn against them both, or how soon he would need to prove that his interest in Elinor Whitmore was not the passing fancy of a bored duke, but something far more determined, something that would eventually carry him through the darkest hours of the night, racing against time itself, for her sake. The carriage ride home was quiet. Lady Margaret said little, though Elinor could feel her aunt's sharp gaze studying her in the dim light, as though reassessing something she had believed settled only the night before. "You spoke with Mr. Ashcombe for quite some time," Lady Margaret finally said, her voice carefully neutral. "He was pleasant company," Elinor replied, choosing her words cautiously. "Pleasant," Lady Margaret's tone gave nothing away. "And did he mention calling on you?" Elinor hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal. "He asked if he might, yes." Something flickered across her aunt's face, gone before Elinor could fully read it. "How curious," Lady Margaret murmured, more to herself than to Elinor. "How very curious indeed." She said nothing further for the remainder of the ride, but Elinor could sense that her aunt's mind had shifted into a different kind of attention, one that felt less like disinterest and more like calculation. She did not know what her aunt was thinking, only that something had changed, and that change unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Charlotte, sitting beside her, reached over and squeezed her hand gently, a small gesture of reassurance that Elinor held onto for the rest of the journey home. She did not sleep well that night. Her mind kept returning to the conversation in the garden, to the warmth in Nathaniel's voice when he asked to call on her, to the strange, unfamiliar feeling of being truly seen by someone for the first time in years. She did not know, as she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, that her aunt was awake as well, sitting alone in her study, turning over a plan that had nothing to do with Elinor's happiness, and everything to do with securing whatever advantage this unexpected connection might bring to the Whitmore family name. The gathering had ended, but for both Elinor and Nathaniel the story had only just begun. Ravensbrook Manor sat at the end of a long avenue of elm trees, its stone walls pale gray against the morning sky. Nathaniel arrived home well past midnight, though sleep did not come easily. He lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling of his chamber, replaying the conversation in the garden again and again, surprised at how thoroughly one evening had unsettled the careful order of his thoughts. By the time the sun rose, he had made a decision. He intended to call on Elinor Whitmore properly, and he intended to do so soon. He came down to breakfast to find his mother, the Dowager Duchess Beatrice, already seated at the long table, sorting through a stack of correspondence with the brisk efficiency she applied to everything in her life. "You are up early," she observed, not looking up from her letters. "That is unlike you after one of Lord Ashworth's gatherings. Usually you sleep until noon and complain of the noise for a week." "I met someone interesting," Nathaniel said, taking his seat. His mother's hand stilled. Slowly she looked up, her sharp eyes assessing him with the particular attention she reserved for matters of family importance. "Interesting how?" "Interesting enough that I intend to call on her." The Duchess set down her letter entirely now, giving her son her full attention. "And who is this young woman?" Miss Alina Whitmore. She is the niece of Lady Margaret Whitmore. His mother's expression shifted, a complicated mixture of curiosity and caution settling over her features. Whitmore. I do not know the family well. Are they of good standing? Respectable enough, I believe, though not wealthy. Ah, the single syllable carried more weight than an entire sentence might have. Nathaniel, you understand the position you are in. You are the Duke of Ravensbrook. Your marriage is not a matter of personal preference alone. It carries consequence for the entire estate, for the tenants who depend on this family's stability, for the alliances your father spent his life building. I am aware of my position, Mother. Then you are also aware that Lady Ashworth has already suggested Lady Constance Fairweather as a suitable match. Her family holds considerable land bordering our northern estates. Such a union would strengthen both families significantly. Nathaniel set down his fork, appetite fading. This conversation was not new. It had repeated itself in various forms for nearly 3 years, ever since his father's death had placed the full weight of the dukedom on his shoulders at the age of 26. I have met Lady Constance, he said carefully. She is perfectly pleasant. She is also entirely uninterested in anything beyond fashion and gossip, and she has made it clear, on more than one occasion, that she finds conversation with me tedious unless the subject concerns my title or my income. Marriage is not built on conversation, Nathaniel. It is built on stability, on duty, on the careful management of family interests across generations. I disagree, Mother. I have watched you and Father's marriage closely enough to know that the two of you built something far more than an arrangement of convenience. His mother's expression softened just slightly at the mention of his late father. That is different. Your father and I were fortunate. Such fortune is not guaranteed to everyone, and it is certainly not a foundation upon which to build the future of an entire dukedom. Nathaniel said nothing for a long moment, staring at the table between them. He understood his mother's concerns. He understood, better than most, the pressures of his position, the endless expectations that came with a title he had never particularly wanted but had inherited nonetheless. He had spent 3 years attending gatherings, meeting eligible women, enduring conversations that revolved entirely around his rank and his wealth, until he had begun to wonder whether any woman in his social circle could ever see him as anything more than the sum of his title and his fortune. Until last night. I intend to call on Miss Whitmore, he said finally, his voice quiet but resolute. Whatever comes of it, I would like the chance to know her properly, without the weight of every expectation this family has placed upon my shoulders since the day I was born. His mother studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression suggested she recognized the futility of arguing further, at least for now. Very well, she said at last. Call on her. But Nathaniel, do be careful. A duke's attention, even briefly given, can change the course of a young woman's entire life, for better or for worse. Do not offer it lightly. Nathaniel thought of Alina's laughter in the garden, unguarded and genuine, and of the quiet dignity with which she had spoken about the dishonesty of performed conversation. He did not think, whatever came of this, that his attention toward her would be given lightly. He had never felt less inclined to be careful in his life. Over the following days, Nathaniel found himself unable to focus on the usual demands of managing his estate. Correspondence went unanswered longer than it should have. Meetings with his steward were shorter than usual, his attention drifting despite his best efforts. He caught himself, more than once, staring out the window of his study, thinking not of crop yields or tenant disputes, but of a conversation in a candle-lit garden, and the sound of a laugh that had felt, somehow, entirely honest. He made discreet inquiries about the Whitmore family, careful not to draw undue attention to his interest. What he learned troubled him. Lady Margaret Whitmore, he discovered, was known in certain circles for a sharp tongue and a reputation for managing her household with considerable severity. Her niece, Alina, had lived under her roof since the death of her parents a decade earlier, and though little was known about the details of her daily life, Whispers suggested that the girl's position in the household was precarious at best, tolerated rather than valued. He also learned that Lord Pemberton, a baron with a reputation for cruelty toward his servants, had recently proposed to Alina and been refused, a refusal that had apparently caused considerable friction within the Whitmore household. The more Nathaniel learned, the more his initial curiosity deepened into something closer to concern. He thought of Alina's composed expression at the gathering, the careful way she had chosen her words, the quiet strength beneath her calm exterior, and he began to wonder just how much of that composure had been built out of necessity rather than natural temperament. He decided to call on her the following week, giving himself just enough time to arrange matters properly, to ensure his visit would be received with the formality her aunt would expect. He did not anticipate how quickly circumstances within the Whitmore household would shift in the days before his planned visit, or how close he would come to losing the chance to know Alina at all. Lady Margaret, meanwhile, had spent those same days consumed by calculations of her own. The knowledge that a duke had shown interest in Alina had unsettled the careful order of her plans, and she did not intend to let the situation unfold without her direct involvement. She summoned Alina to her study on the third day after the gathering, her expression carefully composed, betraying none of the calculating thoughts that had occupied her since Lord Ashworth's revelation. "I understand Mr. Ashcombe intends to call on you," she said, watching Alina's face closely for any reaction. "He mentioned the possibility, yes," Alina replied cautiously, uncertain what response her aunt was seeking. "How fortunate," Lady Margaret said, though her tone remained difficult to read. "I trust you understand the importance of conducting yourself appropriately during such a visit. First impressions matter a great deal, Alina, particularly with a man of Mr. Ashcombe's standing." Alina frowned slightly, catching something strange in her aunt's phrasing. His standing. Lady Margaret's expression flickered, a brief moment of hesitation before she recovered her composure. "His character, I mean, his reputation. You would do well not to embarrass this family, given how rare such an opportunity is likely to be." Alina said nothing, though the exchange left her with a vague unease she could not quite place. There was something her aunt was not telling her, some piece of information deliberately withheld, though Alina could not begin to guess what it might be. She would not learn the truth of Nathaniel's identity for several more days, and when she finally did, it would come not from her aunt, nor from Nathaniel himself, but from an unexpected source that would complicate everything she thought she understood about the man she had met in the garden. For now she simply nodded, agreed to conduct herself appropriately, and returned to her small room at the top of the house, where she sat by the window once again, wondering about the strange, unhurried kindness of a man named Mr. Ashcombe, and hoping, against every lesson her aunt had taught her, that he might truly call on her after all. Downstairs, Lady Margaret remained in her study long after Alina had gone, a letter half written on the desk before her, addressed to a distant cousin who, she recalled, had once been in service to a family connected distantly to the Ravensbrook estate. If there was information to be gathered about a duke's intentions, about the true extent of his wealth and the possibilities such a connection might offer, Lady Margaret intended to gather it thoroughly, and to use whatever she learned in whatever way best served her own interests, regardless of what Alina herself might want. The days that followed carried a strange, quiet tension through Whitmore House, as though the entire household sensed that something significant was approaching, even if no one could yet say precisely what it was. The letter arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, delivered by a messenger who did not wait for a reply before departing. Lady Margaret read it twice at her writing desk, her expression shifting from careful neutrality to something sharper, something closer to triumph mixed with calculation. Her cousin had confirmed what Lord Ashworth had let slip at the gathering. Mr. Ashcombe was indeed Nathaniel Ashcombe, the Duke of Ravensbrook, one of the wealthiest and most eligible men in the country, a man whose attention any family would consider an extraordinary stroke of fortune. Lady Margaret sat back in her chair, turning the information over in her mind. A duke. Her plain, difficult, unmarriageable niece had somehow captured the attention of a duke, and Lady Margaret intended to make certain that whatever came of this connection benefited the Whitmore family as thoroughly as possible, regardless of what Alina herself might prefer. She did not tell Alina the truth. Instead, she began, quietly and methodically, to reshape the situation to her own advantage. Her first move was to accelerate matters with Lord Pemberton. Despite Alina's earlier refusal, Lord Pemberton had not entirely withdrawn his interest, largely because Lady Margaret had made clear, in private conversations the Baron never suspected Alina knew about, that a considerable dowry might yet be arranged if the marriage could be settled quickly and quietly. Lord Pemberton, eager to secure a young wife and indifferent to the particulars of how such an arrangement came about, had agreed to reconsider. What Lady Margaret now understood, with the confirmation of Nathaniel's true identity, was that a hurried marriage to Lord Pemberton would serve her purposes far better than a prolonged courtship with a duke. A duke's attention, however flattering, was uncertain, unpredictable, entirely outside her control. Lord Pemberton, by contrast, was a known quantity, a man she could manage, a man whose gratitude for a favorable dowry arrangement might translate into ongoing financial support for the Whitmore household long after the marriage was settled. She summoned Alina to her study once again, 3 days after receiving the letter, her expression composed into practiced calm. "Lord Pemberton has renewed his offer," she said without preamble. Alina felt the floor shift beneath her. "I refused him already, Aunt. I made my feelings on the matter perfectly clear." "Your feelings are not the only consideration in this household, Alina. You are 22 years old. Your prospects are limited. Lord Pemberton offers security, a household of your own, a position in society far better than anything you might otherwise expect. He is cruel to his servants. He mocked a serving girl until she wept, simply for the amusement of his companions. I will not marry a man who finds pleasure in the suffering of those who cannot defend themselves." "You will marry whom I decide is best for this family," Lady Margaret said, her voice hardening. "I have provided for you for 10 years, Alina, fed you, clothed you, sheltered you, when I had no obligation to do so beyond the thinnest thread of family duty. It is time you repaid that generosity." Alina's hands trembled at her sides, though she kept her voice steady through sheer force of will. "And what of Mr. Ashcombe? He asked to call on me. You gave your permission." Something flickered across Lady Margaret's face, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Mr. Ashcombe's intentions are uncertain, and uncertainty is a luxury this family cannot afford. Lord Pemberton's offer is concrete. It is here now, and I intend to accept it on your behalf. You cannot force me to marry him. I can make your life considerably more difficult if you refuse," Lady Margaret said, her voice cold and final. "I can remove you from this house entirely. I can ensure that no family of standing takes you in afterward. I can make certain, Alina, that whatever small comforts you currently enjoy disappear entirely. Consider your choice carefully." Alina left her aunt's study that evening feeling as though the walls of Whitmore House had closed in around her entirely, trapping her within a decision that was not truly hers to make. She found Charlotte in the small sitting room upstairs, working at her needlework by candlelight, and the moment Alina's cousin saw her face, she set the fabric aside entirely. "What has happened?" Alina sank into the chair across from her, the events of the evening spilling out in a rush of quiet, desperate words. Charlotte listened with growing horror, her needlework forgotten entirely on the small table beside her. "She cannot force you," Charlotte said finally, though her voice carried less certainty than her words suggested. "She can and she will," Alina replied. "You know how this household works, Charlotte. Aunt Margaret has never once asked what I want. Why would tonight be any different? But Mr. Ashcombe has said nothing further since the gathering. It has been nearly a week, Charlotte. Perhaps his interest was nothing more than polite conversation at a party already forgotten." Even as she said the words, Eleanor did not entirely believe them. She thought of the warmth in Nathaniel's voice when he had asked to call on her, of the genuine curiosity in his questions, the way he had listened as though her answers truly mattered to him. It had not felt like idle conversation. It had felt like something real, something worth hoping for. But hope, Eleanor had learned over 10 long years in her aunt's household, was a luxury she could rarely afford, and she did not intend to build her future on a foundation as fragile as a single evening's promise. "What will you do?" Charlotte asked quietly. Eleanor stared into the candle flame for a long moment before answering. "I do not know. I truly do not know." Meanwhile, at Ravensbrook Manor, Nathaniel had finally arranged his schedule to allow for the promised visit, and he arrived at Whitmore House on a crisp autumn afternoon, dressed formally, his carriage bearing the ducal crest he had deliberately concealed at the gathering the week before. Lady Margaret received him in the parlor with an enthusiasm that struck Nathaniel as somewhat excessive, given her reputation for severity that his inquiries had suggested. She offered tea, complimented his estate, his family, his evident good taste, all while carefully avoiding any mention of Eleanor at all. "Might I see Miss Whitmore?" Nathaniel finally asked, growing impatient with the extended pleasantries. Lady Margaret's smile did not waver, though something calculating flickered behind her eyes. "I am afraid Eleanor is unwell today, Your Grace. A headache, nothing serious, but she is resting and unable to receive visitors." Nathaniel frowned slightly, an uneasy feeling settling in his chest that he could not quite explain. "I see. Perhaps I might call again tomorrow, then." Of course," Lady Margaret said smoothly. "Though I should mention, Your Grace, that Eleanor's circumstances are somewhat delicate at present. There is another matter, a family arrangement of some importance, that requires her attention in the coming days. I would not wish for Your Grace's kindness to place any undue burden upon her during such a sensitive time." The words were vague, deliberately so, but Nathaniel understood with growing unease that something was being concealed from him, some obstacle deliberately placed between himself and Eleanor that Lady Margaret had no intention of explaining clearly. He left Whitmore House that afternoon with far more questions than answers, and a growing determination to find out precisely what Lady Margaret Whitmore was hiding, and what danger, if any, it posed to the woman who had occupied his thoughts so completely since the night they met. He did not yet know about Lord Pemberton's renewed offer, or the deadline Lady Margaret intended to impose upon her niece's future. He knew only that something was wrong, and that whatever it was, he intended to uncover the truth before it was too late. What he could not have predicted was how little time remained before Lady Margaret's plans would be set irreversibly into motion, or how close Eleanor would come to losing any chance of choosing her own future at all. Nathaniel did not return to Ravensbrook Manor directly after his visit to Whitmore House. Instead, he directed his carriage toward Lord Ashworth's estate, his mind turning over Lady Margaret's evasive answers with growing suspicion. Something about the encounter had felt wrong, staged even, and Nathaniel had spent enough years navigating the careful performances of society to recognize when someone was concealing information rather than simply withholding it out of privacy. He found Lord Ashworth in his study, reviewing accounts, and the older man looked up with surprise at his unexpected visitor. "Ravensbrook, this is unexpected. Come in, come in." Nathaniel wasted little time on pleasantries. "I need information regarding the Whitmore family, specifically regarding Miss Eleanor Whitmore's situation." Lord Ashworth's expression shifted, curiosity mixing with something more cautious. "You have taken quite an interest in that young woman, it seems." "I have. And I believe her aunt is concealing something from me, something that may not be in Miss Whitmore's best interest." Lord Ashworth set down his pen, considering the request carefully before answering. "I do not know a great deal, but my wife has mentioned certain rumors. Lady Margaret has been in considerable financial difficulty these past 2 years. Poor investments, mounting debts. There has been talk of arrangements with Lord Pemberton, a marriage for Miss Whitmore that would settle a portion of those debts through a favorable dowry agreement. Nathaniel's stomach tightened. Pemberton, the same man known for his cruelty toward servants. The very same. Miss Whitmore refused him once already, from what I understand, though rumor suggests Lady Margaret has not entirely abandoned the arrangement. Nathaniel rose from his chair, his mind racing through the implications of what he had just learned. Alina's refusal to see him that afternoon had not been due to illness at all. It had been Lady Margaret's deliberate effort to keep him away, to prevent any interference while she pursued a marriage that would serve her own financial interests rather than her niece's happiness. "Thank you, Ashworth," Nathaniel said, already moving toward the door. "I believe I need to act quickly." "Ravensbrook," Lord Ashworth called after him, "be careful. If Lady Margaret has already committed to an arrangement with Pemberton, interfering could create considerable scandal for both families and for yourself." "I am aware," Nathaniel replied, pausing at the doorway. "But I find I care rather less about scandal than I do about allowing a woman I admire to be forced into a marriage with a man known for cruelty, simply to settle her aunt's debts." He left Ashworth's estate with a growing sense of urgency, though he knew he needed more concrete information before taking any direct action. A duke could not simply appear at Whitmore House demanding answers without risking exactly the kind of scandal Lord Ashworth had warned him about. Scandal that could ultimately harm Alina's reputation more than help her situation. He needed to speak with Alina directly, away from her aunt's watchful presence, and he needed to do so soon. Over the following days, Nathaniel arranged, through careful and discreet inquiry, to learn Alina's regular habits. He discovered, through a conversation with a shopkeeper in the village near Whitmore House, that Alina walked most mornings before the household woke, following a familiar path through the small park at the edge of town. He arrived early the following morning, positioning himself near the park entrance, uncertain whether she would appear at all, uncertain even if this approach was wise, but unwilling to wait any longer while Lady Margaret's plans continued to unfold without his knowledge. Alina appeared just after dawn, exactly as the shopkeeper had described, walking with quick, purposeful steps along the gravel path, her breath visible in the cold morning air. She stopped abruptly when she saw him waiting near the entrance, surprise and something like relief crossing her face in quick succession. "Mr. Ashcombe," she said, though there was a question in her voice, an uncertainty about whether she should be pleased or wary at his sudden appearance. "Miss Whitmore, forgive the intrusion, but I needed to speak with you, and it seemed your aunt was not entirely willing to permit that through proper channels." Alina's expression grew guarded. "You called on me. I was told you were informed I was unwell." "You were not unwell, I think." Alina hesitated, torn between loyalty to her aunt and the growing certainty that honesty at this point mattered more than propriety. "No," she admitted quietly, "I was not unwell." "Then perhaps you might tell me what has truly happened, Miss Whitmore. I have heard troubling things, and I would rather hear the truth from you than continue guessing at half-formed rumors." Alina looked away, staring at the frost-covered grass beside the path, and for a long moment Nathaniel wondered if she intended to refuse him entirely. Then slowly the words began to come, hesitant at first, then faster, as though a dam long held closed had finally begun to break. She told him everything. The years of quiet cruelty within her aunt's household, the constant reminders of her unwanted presence, the arrangement with Lord Pemberton that Lady Margaret intended to force upon her regardless of Alina's own wishes. She told him about the debts, about the desperation that had shaped her aunt's decisions, about the threat of being cast out entirely if she refused to comply. Nathaniel listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with every detail, though his anger, Alina noticed, was never directed at her. It seemed instead to grow entirely on her behalf, a quiet, controlled fury at the unfairness of a situation she had endured for years without any real power to change it. "When is the marriage meant to take place?" he asked once she had finished. "I do not know precisely. Soon, I believe. My aunt has grown increasingly insistent these past few days. I fear she intends to settle the matter before I have any opportunity to refuse again." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight, his mind working through the implications of what he had just learned. "Miss Whitmore, I must tell you something, and I hope you will not think less of me for having withheld it until now." Elinor looked up at him, uncertain what confession might follow. "I am not merely Mr. Ashcombe," he said carefully. "My full name is Nathaniel Ashcombe. I am the Duke of Ravensbrook." Elinor stared at him, the words settling slowly into understanding. A duke. The man who had spoken with her so easily in the garden, who had listened to her opinions with genuine interest, who had asked to call on her with such simple, unassuming warmth, was in fact one of the most powerful men in the country. "You did not tell me," she said finally, her voice carrying a complicated mixture of surprise and something close to hurt. "I did not tell anyone that evening, for reasons I hope you might understand. I have spent years being courted for my title rather than my character, Miss Whitmore. When you spoke with me without any knowledge of my rank, without any calculation in your manner, it felt like the first honest conversation I had experienced in longer than I care to admit. I did not want to lose that honesty by revealing something that would inevitably change how you saw me." Elinor absorbed this slowly, understanding even through her surprise the loneliness that must have driven such a decision. She thought of her own careful performances at gatherings, the constant awareness of being judged and assessed, and she found, despite everything, that she could not truly be angry with him for wanting, just once, to be seen without the weight of his title attached. "I understand," she said quietly. "Though I confess, I do not know what to make of this revelation, given everything else happening in my life at present. I intend to help you, Miss Whitmore, if you will allow it. Whatever your aunt has planned regarding Lord Pemberton, I do not intend to stand aside and allow it to happen without offering you an alternative." "What alternative could you possibly offer?" Elinor asked, though there was no bitterness in the question, only genuine uncertainty about what a duke could realistically do to intervene in a private family matter. "I do not know yet precisely," Nathaniel admitted, "but I intend to find a way. I ask only that you trust me, Miss Whitmore, and that you send word immediately if your aunt's plans move forward more quickly than either of us anticipates." Elinor studied his face for a long moment, searching for any sign of insincerity, any hint that his promises were merely the empty words of a man accustomed to getting whatever he desired. She found none, only quiet, steady determination and something in his eyes that looked remarkably like genuine care. "I will send word," she said finally, "though I do not know how much time either of us truly has." They parted shortly after, both aware that the morning's conversation had changed something fundamental between them, though neither could yet say precisely what shape that change would take. Elinor returned to Whitmore House with her heart heavier and lighter in equal measure, carrying both the fear of what her aunt intended and the fragile, dangerous hope that perhaps, for the first time in 10 years, someone truly intended to fight for her happiness, rather than simply managing her existence for their own convenience. Nathaniel returned to Ravensbrook Manor with a single, unwavering purpose taking shape in his mind. He did not yet know precisely what action he would take, but he knew, with absolute certainty, that he would not allow Elinor Whitmore to be forced into a marriage with a cruel man simply because her aunt valued financial convenience over her niece's well-being. Whatever it cost him, in reputation, in family expectation, in the careful order of a life he had always been told to manage with restraint and duty above all else, he intended to make certain that Elinor had the chance to choose her own future. He did not know, as he sat alone in his study that evening, staring into the fire, just how soon that resolve would be tested, or how far he would ultimately need to go to keep the promise he had made her that cold morning in the park. 3 days after the conversation in the park, Lady Margaret summoned Elinor to the parlor once more, and the moment Elinor saw the papers spread across the table before her aunt, she understood that the time she had hoped for had run out entirely. "Lord Pemberton has agreed to the arrangement," Lady Margaret said without preamble. "The marriage will take place at dawn, 3 days from now, at his estate. A quiet ceremony, nothing extravagant but binding all the same." Aliner's blood went cold. 3 days. "Aunt, you cannot possibly expect me to simply agree to this without any further discussion." "There is nothing further to discuss. The documents are signed. The arrangement is settled. You will attend the ceremony, Aliner, and you will do so willingly, or you will do so unwillingly. Either way, the outcome remains the same." "And if I refuse?" Lady Margaret's expression turned to stone. "Then you will leave this house tonight with nothing but the clothes on your back, and you will discover precisely how difficult the world can be for a woman with no family, no fortune, and no reputation to speak of. I have made my decision, Aliner. This conversation is finished." Aliner left the parlor shaking, her mind racing through possibilities, none of them offering any real hope of escape. She found Charlotte waiting anxiously in the hallway, having overheard enough of the conversation through the door to understand the gravity of the situation. "You must send word to the Duke," Charlotte whispered urgently, "now before it is too late." "How? Aunt Margaret watches everything. She will notice if a letter leaves this house." "I will take it myself," Charlotte said firmly. "Tonight, after the household has settled, I know the servant's entrance well enough to leave unnoticed." Aliner hesitated only a moment before nodding, gratitude and fear tangled together in her chest. She wrote the letter quickly, her hand trembling as she explained the situation, the 3 days remaining, the location of Lord Pemberton's estate, the desperate hope that Nathaniel might somehow find a way to help her, though she could not imagine what that help might look like, given how quickly circumstances had moved beyond anyone's easy control. Charlotte delivered the letter that same night, slipping out through the servant's entrance under cover of darkness and making her way to a messenger service that promised delivery to Ravensbrook Manor by morning. Nathaniel received the letter shortly after breakfast, and the color drained from his face as he read Aliner's careful, urgent words. 3 days. A marriage arranged, documents already signed. A ceremony planned at dawn on a date that suddenly felt impossibly close. He spent the remainder of that day in frantic activity, consulting with his solicitor about any legal avenue that might delay or prevent the marriage, sending inquiries to contacts who might know more about the specifics of Lord Pemberton's arrangement with Lady Margaret. What he learned offered little comfort. The marriage documents, once signed by both parties, carried significant legal weight, and short of Aliner's direct refusal at the ceremony itself, there appeared to be no straightforward way to prevent it through legal means alone. Which meant, Nathaniel realized with growing certainty, that he would need to reach Aliner before the ceremony took place, and offer her in person the choice her aunt had denied her, a choice between the marriage being forced upon her and whatever alternative he could provide. He did not yet know what that alternative would be. He knew only that he could not allow the ceremony to proceed without at least trying to intervene. The following 2 days passed in a blur of careful planning. Nathaniel confirmed the location and timing of the ceremony through his contacts, learning that Lord Pemberton's estate lay nearly 40 miles from Ravensbrook Manor, a considerable distance to cover, particularly if circumstances required urgency. He also spoke with his mother, finally revealing the full situation he had learned about Aliner's circumstances. The Dowager Duchess listened in silence, her expression unreadable throughout most of the explanation, though something shifted in her eyes when Nathaniel described the cruelty Aliner had endured under her aunt's care, the desperate arrangement with a man known for unkindness toward those beneath him. "You intend to stop this marriage," she said finally, not quite a question. "I do. And if you fail, if Lord Pemberton and Lady Margaret refuse to allow any interference, regardless of your title, then at least Aliner will know that someone tried, Mother. That she was not simply abandoned to a fate she never chose for herself." The Duchess studied her son for a long moment, and something in her expression softened, a recognition, perhaps, of the same conviction that had once driven her own late husband to make difficult, unpopular decisions when he believed strongly enough in their rightness. "Then you should not go alone," she said finally. "Take proper witnesses, Nathaniel, and proper documentation of your intentions. If you mean to challenge this marriage, do so with everything at your disposal, not merely good intentions and desperate timing." Nathaniel spent the following day gathering exactly that, arranging for his solicitor to accompany him along with proper legal documentation, asserting his intention to offer Eleanor an alternative marriage proposal, one that would supersede any arrangement Lady Margaret had made without her niece's genuine consent. On the evening before the ceremony was to take place, word reached him through a final message from Charlotte that Lady Margaret intended to move up the timing, fearful, perhaps, that Eleanor might find some way to escape the arrangement if given too much time. The ceremony, Charlotte's hurried note explained, would now take place at first light rather than mid-morning as originally planned, leaving Nathaniel with far less time than he had anticipated. The message arrived just past midnight, delivered by an exhausted messenger who had ridden through worsening weather to reach Ravensbrook Manor as quickly as possible. Outside, rain had begun to fall in heavy sheets, thunder rolling across the darkened countryside, the kind of storm that made sensible men stay indoors and wait for morning. Nathaniel read the message twice, his heart pounding with the sudden, urgent understanding that he no longer had the luxury of a full day to prepare. If the ceremony was moving to dawn, he needed to leave immediately, riding through the night and the storm alike, if he intended to reach Lord Pemberton's estate before Eleanor was forced into a marriage she had never wanted. "Your Grace, this is madness," his solicitor protested, pulling on his coat despite his objections. "Riding through this storm at this hour, across 40 miles of unfamiliar road, we risk considerable danger to ourselves and to the horses." "I am aware of the danger," Nathaniel said, already moving toward the stables, his own coat gathered hastily against the cold. "But I am considerably more concerned about the danger Eleanor faces if I arrive too late to prevent this marriage entirely." They set out just after 1 in the morning, 3 riders moving through driving rain and howling wind, the road ahead barely visible in the darkness beyond their lanterns. The horses struggled against the mud and the wind, their pace slower than Nathaniel would have liked, every mile feeling like an eternity as he calculated and recalculated the hours remaining before dawn. The storm worsened as the night wore on, rain turning to hail at one point, forcing them to shelter briefly beneath a stand of trees before continuing onward once the worst of it passed. Nathaniel's solicitor argued, more than once, that they should wait for the storm to clear, that arriving safely in the morning would serve their purpose better than risking injury or worse in the darkness. Nathaniel refused every suggestion to slow their pace, driven by an urgency that overrode every rational consideration of safety or comfort. He thought, as he rode through the storm, of Eleanor's face in the garden that first evening, her quiet composure, the genuine warmth of her laughter when something truly amused her. He thought of the years of cruelty she had endured under her aunt's roof, the constant reminder that she was unwanted, unworthy, destined to be married off to whatever arrangement best served someone else's interests rather than her own happiness. He would not allow that pattern to continue, not while he had breath left in his body and strength enough to reach her in time. The hours passed in a blur of cold rain and aching muscles, the horses growing tired, the road growing increasingly difficult to navigate as the storm continued its assault on the countryside. At one point, Nathaniel's horse stumbled badly in the mud, nearly throwing him entirely, and he was forced to dismount briefly to check the animal for injury before continuing onward at a more careful pace. By the time the first gray hints of dawn began to appear on the horizon, Nathaniel estimated they had covered perhaps 30 of the 40 miles required, with the storm showing no sign of relenting and the horses growing dangerously exhausted beneath them. "Your Grace," his solicitor called out over the wind, "we cannot push the horses much further. If we lose them to exhaustion, we will be stranded entirely, and Miss Whitmore's situation will only worsen." Nathaniel knew the man was right. though every instinct screamed against slowing down even slightly. He glanced at the horizon, calculating the remaining distance against the fading darkness, understanding with growing dread that they might not arrive before the ceremony began, regardless of how hard they pushed forward. He thought, in that desperate moment, of every argument his mother had made about duty and consequence, about the careful management of a dukedom's reputation, about the countless expectations placed upon his shoulders since the day of his birth. None of it mattered, in that instant, against the simple, overwhelming determination to reach Elinor before it was too late. "We continue," he said finally, his voice hoarse from shouting over the storm. "Whatever the cost to the horses, whatever the cost to ourselves, we continue." They pressed onward through the final miles as the sky slowly lightened from black to gray, the storm finally beginning to weaken as dawn approached, though the road remained treacherous with mud and standing water. Nathaniel's entire body ached with exhaustion and cold, his hands nearly numb around the reins, but he did not slow his pace, driven by a single, unwavering thought that eclipsed every other consideration entirely. He had to reach her. Whatever it cost him, whatever risk it required, he had to reach Elinor Whitmore before Lord Pemberton's ceremony could take her future away from her entirely. The gates of Lord Pemberton's estate finally came into view as the first true light of morning broke across the horizon, and Nathaniel felt something close to desperate relief, mixed with dawning terror at how little time might remain before the ceremony began. He spurred his exhausted horse forward one final time, racing up the long drive toward the estate's entrance, uncertain whether he would arrive in time, uncertain what awaited him within those walls, certain only that he would not stop, could not stop, until he knew Elinor's fate for himself. Inside Lord Pemberton's estate, Elinor stood in a small chamber near the chapel, dressed in a pale gray gown that Lady Margaret had selected for her without any regard for Elinor's own wishes. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, hardly recognizing the pale, hollow-eyed woman looking back at her. She had not slept. She had spent the night sitting by the window of the small guest chamber she had been given, watching the storm rage outside, wondering if Charlotte's message had truly reached Nathaniel, wondering if he would come at all, or if she had allowed herself to hope for something that had never been more than a passing kindness from a man with considerably more important matters to occupy his attention. Lady Margaret entered the chamber without knocking, her expression brisk and businesslike, entirely unmoved by the pale, exhausted state of her niece. "The ceremony begins in 20 minutes. Lord Pemberton is already waiting." "Aunt, please," Elinor said, her voice breaking slightly despite her effort to remain composed. "I am asking you one final time to reconsider. I do not love this man. I do not even respect him. Please do not force me into this marriage." "Love and respect are luxuries, Elinor, afforded to women with greater fortune than yourself. You will marry Lord Pemberton this morning, and in time, you will come to understand that I have done you a considerable favor, securing your future when no one else was willing to take on that burden." Elinor said nothing further, understanding with a kind of hollow finality that no argument she could offer would change her aunt's mind. She allowed herself to be led from the chamber toward the small estate chapel, her steps slow and heavy, her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and the last, fragile threads of hope she could not quite bring herself to release entirely. The chapel was small but formally arranged. A handful of witnesses gathered near the front, Lord Pemberton standing at the altar in a dark coat, his expression carrying the satisfied confidence of a man who believed he had already secured everything he desired. Elinor's steps slowed as she entered, her eyes moving across the small gathering, searching, despite herself, for any sign of the man who had promised to help her. He was not there. Her heart sank as the ceremony began, the officiant's voice carrying through the small chapel formal words that felt increasingly distant and unreal, as Elinor stood beside Lord Pemberton, her hands cold, her mind desperately searching for some way to stop what was happening, some final argument that might yet change her fate. The officiant had barely begun the formal vows when the chapel doors burst open with a force that echoed through the stone hall. Nathaniel stood in the doorway, soaked entirely through from the storm, his coat torn and mud-splattered, his expression carrying an intensity that silenced the small gathering instantly. Behind him, his solicitor entered as well, carrying a leather folder of documents, both men clearly exhausted from a journey that had pushed them to the very limits of endurance. "This ceremony will not continue," Nathaniel said, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence of the chapel. Lord Pemberton turned, his face flushing with immediate anger. "Who in the devil are you, sir, to interrupt a private ceremony?" "Nathaniel Ashcombe," he said, stepping fully into the chapel, Duke of Ravensbrook. "And I have come to offer Miss Whitmore a choice that has, until this moment, been entirely denied to her." A ripple of shocked murmurs moved through the small gathering of witnesses. Lady Margaret's face had gone pale, her earlier confidence crumbling into visible uncertainty at the sudden, unexpected appearance of a duke in the middle of her carefully arranged plans. "Your Grace," Lord Pemberton said, his tone shifting quickly from anger to wary calculation, "I do not understand what business this marriage could possibly hold for a man of your standing." "My business," Nathaniel said, walking slowly up the aisle toward the altar, "is Miss Whitmore's well-being and her right to choose her own future, rather than have it decided entirely by others without her genuine consent." He turned to Alina then, his expression softening as their eyes met for the first time since he had entered the chapel. She stood frozen near the altar, hardly able to believe what was happening, the desperate hope she had tried so hard to suppress now blooming fully into overwhelming relief. "Miss Whitmore," Nathaniel said, his voice quieter now though it still carried clearly through the silent chapel, "I have ridden through the night, through storm and difficulty, because I could not allow this marriage to proceed without giving you the chance to choose otherwise, if choosing otherwise is truly what you want. I am not here to force any decision upon you. I am here only to ensure that the decision, whatever it may be, is truly your own." Alina's eyes filled with tears she had been holding back for what felt like an eternity, tears of relief, of gratitude, of a hope so fragile and precious, she could hardly believe it had survived the long, desperate night. "You came," she whispered. "I promised I would help if it was within my power," Nathaniel said. "I intend to keep that promise." Lady Margaret stepped forward then, her voice sharp with barely controlled fury. "This is outrageous. The documents are signed. This marriage is legally binding. You cannot simply arrive and disrupt an arrangement that has already been properly settled." "The documents were signed by Lady Margaret and Lord Pemberton," Nathaniel's solicitor interjected calmly, stepping forward with his leather folder of papers. "Miss Whitmore's own consent, freely and genuinely given, was never properly secured. Without that consent, your ladyship, I am afraid the legal foundation of this marriage is considerably weaker than you have led everyone to believe." Lady Margaret's face reddened with fury and mounting desperation. "She is my ward. I am entitled to arrange suitable marriages on her behalf." "She is 22 years old, Lady Margaret," Nathaniel said firmly. "A grown woman entitled to her own opinion regarding her own future. I do not believe any court in this country would uphold a marriage entered into under such evident coercion, particularly once the full circumstances of this arrangement, including the financial debts motivating it, become more widely known." The threat, though delivered calmly, carried unmistakable weight. Lady Margaret's expression shifted rapidly between fury and growing alarm at the prospect of her financial difficulties becoming public knowledge, a scandal that would damage the Whitmore family name far more severely than any refused marriage ever could. Lord Pemberton, sensing the shifting tide of the confrontation, stepped back slightly from the altar, his earlier confidence rapidly deflating. "I have no wish to be involved in any scandal, Your Grace. If Miss Whitmore's consent was never properly secured, I withdraw my claim to this marriage entirely." The chapel fell into a tense, uncertain silence as every eye turned toward Alina, waiting for her response, waiting to see what she would choose now that the choice, for the first time in this entire ordeal, genuinely belonged to her. Alina looked at her aunt, seeing, perhaps for the first time, not the sharp, commanding woman who had ruled her existence for 10 years, but someone smaller, more desperate, more thoroughly undone by her own poor decisions than Alina had ever fully understood. "Aunt Margaret," Alina said quietly, her voice steady despite the emotion still coursing through her, "I forgive you for the debts, and I forgive you in time for the cruelty. But I will not marry Lord Pemberton, not today, not ever. I am choosing my own future now, whatever that future may hold." Lady Margaret opened her mouth as though to argue further, then closed it again, seeming to understand, finally, that the situation had moved entirely beyond her control. She said nothing more, standing rigid and silent as the small gathering of witnesses began to disperse, murmuring quietly among themselves about the extraordinary scene they had just witnessed. Nathaniel crossed the remaining distance to Alina, offering his hand, which she took without hesitation, her fingers cold but steady against his. "I am sorry it took so long to reach you," he said quietly. "You came," Alina said again, as though the fact still felt too extraordinary to fully believe. "Through the storm, all that distance for me." "I would have ridden considerably further," Nathaniel said, "if it meant reaching you in time." Around them, the chapel slowly emptied, Lord Pemberton departing quickly to avoid further scandal, the small gathering of witnesses dispersing with quiet whispers that would, within days, spread through every drawing room and social gathering for miles around. Lady Margaret remained standing near the altar, alone and silent, watching the collapse of every plan she had so carefully constructed, though whether her expression carried more anger or genuine regret, Alina could not entirely tell. Alina did not yet know what the future held, what shape her life might take now that the marriage she had dreaded was finally, truly avoided. She knew only that for the first time in 10 years, she had been given the chance to choose her own path forward, and that choice, however uncertain, felt like the truest gift anyone had ever offered her. The weeks that followed the disrupted ceremony brought changes to Alina's life that she could scarcely have imagined only a month before. Word of the confrontation at Lord Pemberton's estate spread quickly through society, and though some whispered disapprovingly about the scandal of an interrupted marriage, far more found themselves captivated by the story of a duke who had ridden through a storm to save a woman from a marriage she never wanted. Lady Margaret's financial difficulties, once carefully hidden, became public knowledge within weeks, and the resulting scandal proved far more damaging to her standing in society than any refused marriage could have been. She retreated from public life considerably, her household reduced, her influence diminished, though Alina, despite everything her aunt had put her through, found she could not entirely enjoy witnessing her aunt's downfall. There remained, beneath the years of hurt, a strange thread of pity for a woman who had allowed fear and desperation to override every consideration of kindness. Charlotte remained with her mother, though the relationship between Alina and her cousin only strengthened in the months that followed. Charlotte's small acts of courage during the crisis never forgotten by Alina, who made certain her cousin always had a place in whatever future awaited her. Nathaniel called on Alina properly in the weeks following the incident, this time with no concealment of his identity, no pretense at being anything other than exactly who he was. Their conversations continued much as they had begun in the garden that first evening, honest and unhurried, filled with genuine curiosity rather than calculated performance. "I find myself wondering," Alina said one afternoon as they walked together through the gardens of Ravensbrook Manor, "why a duke, with every advantage available to him, chose to risk so much for a woman with nothing to offer in return." Nathaniel considered the question seriously, as he considered most things she asked him. "I do not believe you have nothing to offer, Miss Whitmore. You offered me something I had not experienced in longer than I care to admit, honest conversation, free of calculation or performance. You offered me the chance to be seen as something other than my title. That is worth considerably more than any dowry or connection I might have gained through a more conventional match." Alina smiled at that, a genuine smile that had become considerably more frequent in the weeks since the storm-soaked confrontation had changed the course of her life entirely. My aunt once told me, she said quietly, that no gentleman would ever want me. Your aunt, Nathaniel said, was profoundly mistaken about a great many things. Alina laughed, the sound carrying easily through the quiet garden, and Nathaniel found himself thinking, as he often did in her presence, that he had never grown tired of that particular sound, and suspected he never would. Their courtship continued through the winter months, careful and unhurried, built not on the desperate urgency of that single storm-swept night, but on the steady accumulation of countless smaller moments, shared conversations, quiet understanding, the gradual discovery that the connection formed in a candle-lit garden had only deepened with every passing week. Nathaniel's mother, initially cautious about her son's choice, found herself won over entirely by Alina's quiet intelligence and genuine warmth. The two women developing an unexpected friendship over long afternoons spent discussing books and household matters, a friendship that surprised everyone, including the Duchess herself. I was wrong to doubt him, she admitted to Alina one afternoon, some months into their acquaintance. I worried he chose foolishly, driven by passing infatuation rather than genuine judgment. I see now that I was mistaken. You are precisely the kind of woman this family needs, Alina, not for your fortune or your connections, but for your character. Alina treasured those words considerably, understanding at last what it felt like to be valued for who she truly was, rather than dismissed for everything she lacked. Nathaniel proposed the following spring, in the same garden where they had first spoken that autumn evening, kneeling beside the same railing where he had asked, so carefully, if he might call on her. I promised myself, he said, that I would never offer my hand lightly, not after watching so many attempt to claim my title rather than my heart. But Alina, I find I can offer you both without hesitation, because you have never once asked for either. Alina, tears bright in her eyes, accepted without a single moment of hesitation, understanding, finally, that the life her aunt had once declared impossible for her had arrived after all, not through desperate compromise or forced arrangement, but through genuine choice, freely given and freely received. Their wedding took place that summer, a considerably grander affair than the quiet ceremony Lady Margaret had once arranged at Lord Pemberton's estate, though Alina insisted, gently but firmly, that the celebration remain intimate, focused on genuine joy rather than empty display. Charlotte stood beside her throughout the ceremony, radiant with happiness for her cousin's transformed fortune. Even Lady Margaret attended, considerably humbled by the months since her plans had unraveled so completely, watching from a quiet corner of the chapel with an expression Alina could not entirely read, though she thought, perhaps, it carried something close to genuine, belated regret. As Alina stood at the altar, exchanging vows with the man who had ridden through storm and darkness to give her the chance to choose her own future, she found herself thinking of her aunt's cruel words from that distant autumn evening, words that had once felt like an unbreakable prophecy of loneliness and rejection. No gentleman will ever want you, her aunt had sneered. Alina looked at Nathaniel, at the quiet devotion in his eyes, at the promise of a future built on genuine partnership rather than desperate compromise, and she understood, with complete and unshakable certainty, just how thoroughly her aunt's cruel prediction had finally been proven wrong. In the years that followed, Alina and Nathaniel built a life together at Ravensbrook Manor that neither had fully dared to imagine during those difficult early days of their acquaintance. Alina, once dismissed as unmarriageable and unwanted, became known throughout the county for her quiet wisdom and genuine kindness, managing the Ravensbrook estate alongside her husband with the same careful attention and honest character that had first drawn Nathaniel to her in that candle-lit garden. She never forgot the lessons of her difficult childhood, the years spent feeling unwanted and undervalued within her aunt's household, and she made certain, throughout her life, to extend particular kindness toward those in similar circumstances, young women without fortune or family support, offering them guidance and assistance whenever the opportunity arose. She established, within a few years of her marriage, a small fund dedicated to supporting orphaned young women, ensuring that no one under her influence would ever have to endure the same desperate powerlessness she had once known. Charlotte, forever grateful for her role in bringing Alina and Nathaniel together, remained a close and constant presence in their lives, eventually marrying a kind gentleman of modest fortune whom she met at Alina's own wedding celebration, their friendship deepening across the years into something as steady and cherished as sisters. Lady Margaret's later years passed more quietly than her earlier ambitions might have suggested. Her financial difficulties gradually resolved through careful management rather than desperate schemes. Her relationship with Alina slowly, cautiously repaired over time, though it never fully recovered the warmth that might have existed between a proper aunt and niece under different circumstances. Alina forgave her, in the end, not because the cruelty of those 10 years had been erased entirely, but because she understood, with the wisdom that only genuine happiness can provide, that carrying bitterness forward would only diminish the joy she had finally found. Nathaniel never regretted, not for a single moment, the decision to ride through that terrible storm, risking everything for the chance to give Alina the choice her aunt had so thoroughly denied her. He often told the story in later years to their own children, a tale of stubborn determination and genuine love triumphing over cruelty and desperate calculation, a reminder that character and courage mattered considerably more than title or fortune, however society might insist otherwise. Alina Whitmore, the woman once told that no gentleman would ever want her, became the Duchess of Ravensbrück, beloved by her husband, cherished by her family, respected throughout the county for her wisdom and her kindness. She lived the remainder of her days surrounded by genuine warmth and quiet happiness, proof, if any was ever needed, that a single cruel prophecy, however confidently delivered, could never truly determine the shape of someone's entire future. And on quiet evenings, when the candles burned low and the memories of that long, storm-swept night returned to her, Alina would often find Nathaniel's hand reaching for hers across the distance between their chairs, a silent reminder that some promises, once made with true and steady conviction, are kept no matter the storm that stands between the promise and its fulfillment.